to another episode of Simplifying the Law. As you may know, or if you are new to this program, this is an initiative by the government of Guyana through the chambers of the Attorney General and Ministry of Legal Affairs for you, the citizens of Guyana, and for your benefit to educate and enlighten you on laws that are being enacted and legislation which may exist already, the provisions within these legislations and what they may entail, not only penalties but generally what the legislation covers, so that persons are aware of the laws of Guyana, because as our Honorable Attorney General says, ignorance of the law is no excuse. So this program is brought to you to enlighten and educate. Today with me I have Miss Renetta Sargent and Miss Candacia Lewis from the chambers of the Attorney General, and they would help me to go through the Local Content Act. Now, this is a new piece of legislation. It was passed in 2021, and it was passed at a very important time in Guyana's development, with Guyana being one of the fastest growing economies in the world, especially due to our now blooming oil and gas sector. This legislation was thought necessary for the benefit of the Guyanese people and to secure their livelihoods. But when persons hear local content, they are not sure of what that terminology there means. Most persons are not even aware that it affects them directly or how it affects them. So that's why I have these two ladies here with me here today, who's going to help me to go through that and simplify the Local Content Act. I'm just going to ask them to introduce themselves for us. Miss Sargent.
Thank you, Richard. A pleasant good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our viewers whenever you are actually viewing this broadcast. My name is Renetta Sargent, and having been with the chambers for almost a decade, I am fortunate enough to have played a dual role in the chambers, both in its advice and litigation department as well as its drafting department. In the advice and litigation department, my major roles see me supporting the Office of the Deputy Solicitor General, representing the state in civil matters, as well as providing legal advice and opinion, while I support the legislative drafting department in carrying out their function of implementing the mandates of the government through legislative measures like drafting primary legislation as well as subsidiary legislation, the Local Content Act being one of them.
Thank you. And Ms. Lewis.
Good morning, Richard, and good morning, viewers, and it's a privilege to be here on the program. My name is Candacia Lewis, and I'm a state counsel, and I'm attached to the Advice and Litigation Department of the Attorney General's Chambers. My primary task basically is to make legal representation on behalf of the state in civil matters, that is both defending, and we've recently started initiating suits. I also lend support to other ministries and other governmental agencies through advice and legal opinion. I am also the liaison officer for Ministry of Human Services, Ministry of Labor, and Ministry of Public Service, as well as Ministry of Finance. I also serve in the capacity as the focal point person for the gender-based bureau from the Ministry of Human Services.
Okay, thank you both. Now, local content, big term. What does this mean? What is local content?
Okay, Richard, like you would have said earlier, when persons in the streets hear local content, they're thinking, okay, this has something to do with the government and ExxonMobil, because people think oil and they only think ExxonMobil. So they're like, okay, this doesn't have anything to do with me at all. Like, I'm not directly affected or impacted by this legislation. However, hopefully at the end of this program, the Guyanese citizens would understand that this local content legislation is directly for Guyanese, and it directly impacts them in a very significant way. So what is local content? So the Act defines local content to mean the monetary value of goods that is provided or services by Guyanese nationals and Guyanese company, and it also talks about capacity development. So to go a little bit further on that, Richard, I would say that local content is a two-dimensional significance for Guyana. So one is that it directly refers to the economy, the goods and services provided by Guyanese and Guyanese nationals, and Guyanese companies. I cannot emphasize that enough because local content is specifically for Guyanese and Guyanese company. And the other aspect of local content is that through this employment of services and the provision of goods, it affects or it impacts the competencies and capabilities for Guyanese nationals again and Guyanese companies to be able to participate effectively and competitively in the petroleum sector generally.
Okay, thank you. And what was the need for legislation pertaining to this local content, and why do you think the government saw the need to legislate for local content?
Well, Richard, as you would have said, it is no secret, or it's well known, that Guyana has become one of the fastest growing economies in the developing world. This is predominantly due to the exploration for and the production of hydrocarbon resources, which are found in Guyana's spaces, the spaces which Guyana exercises its sovereignty, and the general development of the oil and gas industry. Infantile, but it is still burgeoning. With that said, it is admitted that persons who benefited from entering into a production sharing agreement with the government of Guyana did have certain local content, not local content, but social responsibility obligations placed on them. However, those obligations were more or less predetermined by the licensees themselves. Now, the government's local content policy, which is premised on the social and the economic development of Guyana and its people, saw the need to create more of a clear legal and regulatory framework in which the players of the industry would understand their obligations to the people whilst they're developing Guyana's resources, which do belong to the people at the end of the day. And so with that, the government's aim really was to ensure the realization of actual monetary value being retained in country, and to ensure the education, the inclusion, and the advancement and in a competitive sphere of the people of Guyana. I do think that I should say that this was one of the most heavily consulted piece of legislation. The drafting team was led by the Honorable Vice President Dr. Bar Jagdeo, the Honorable Minister of Natural Resources, Mr. Vikram Barrett, and the chief of our house, the Honorable Attorney General, Senior Counsel, Mr. Mohabir Anil Nandlall. We met with several persons in the public sector, the private sector, and experts internationally, regionally, and in an effort to be able to ensure that we create an environment where these resources are properly developed and the people of Guyana are properly benefiting directly from it. Yes, we are a growing economy, but I believe that the government's aim is not just to have a rapidly growing economy, but a sustainable one in which the people themselves can benefit directly, and they don't have to wait on a handout from the government, but they can do that for themselves directly.
And this legislation would enable that.
Definitely.
So how does the government intend to regulate and monitor the use of local content in the development of the oil and gas industry?
Okay, so the Local Content Act, it provides for an administrative mechanism to ensure the realization of the local content provision. So, as we know, nobody could do it alone. So a system was put in place. So we have the minister that is responsible for the petroleum sector, which in our case would be the Minister of Natural Resources, the Honorable Minister Barrett. We have the Secretariat, the Local Content Secretariat, and then we also have some assistance from the Interagency Advisory Committee. Now, I'm just going to explain briefly the role that each arm plays in implementing the provisions of the Local Content Act. So, the minister. So, he, in layman terms, he is the boss. He is the one that would approve all the plans and the applications. Now, he cannot do it alone. No man is an island, right? So, he has what we call the Local Content Secretariat. Now, the Local Content Secretariat, it's a unit that is established within the Ministry of Natural Resources, because this is the ministry that is responsible for the petroleum sector. So in the Ministry of Natural Resources, we have this Local Content Secretariat. Now, in the Local Content Secretariat, we have a director, and then he would have other employees or other members of the unit that would be employed based upon their, of course, the requisite qualifications, their integrity, their expertise in the sector. So these persons would, as a unit, they would ensure that all the provisions or the mandate of the Local Content Act is implemented and enforced. So they would do the check and balances. Also, we have the Interagency Committee. Now, these persons are appointed by the President himself. This interagency committee, as the name suggests, it comes from the various governmental ministries. So you would find persons belonging to this committee. There are persons from Ministry of Legal Affairs, Ministry of Home Affairs, Ministry of Human Resources, and all these various ministries. Like the name suggests, it's interagency. So these persons are appointed by the president, and they would serve a tenure of 1 year. And at the end of that contractual period, if deemed fit, it could be renewed. So their primary purpose is to basically support and give advice to the Secretariat and to the ministry. Now, Richard, just to touch a bit on what the Local Content Secretariat does is that they would develop and maintain measures for the effective implementation of local content provisions. They also develop and implement strategies that will give preference to, or at least see that equal treatment is given to Guyanese nationals and Guyanese companies or Guyanese businesses. They would also be the ones that will be conducting market analysis, as well as make the necessary recommendations to the minister. It is also the Local Content Secretariat that is responsible for developing and maintaining the register. And as we go along in the program, we will expand a little bit more on this register, because this is a pretty important aspect in the Local Content Act and this entire petroleum sector and the operational aspect of it. So, yeah, that's basically the administrative arm of implementing the Local Content Act.
So, one of the functions of the Secretariat is to issue a local content certificate. If you could take us through this and explain what is the certificate and how does someone become eligible for that local content certificate?
Well, Richard, as my colleague would have mentioned, that one of the more important aspects of the legislation has to do with the maintenance, the development and the maintenance of a local content register. Now, once you are qualified and registered, you are issued with this document, which is an annually renewable certificate to say that you are registered on the local content register. Now, persons would want to know, how do I qualify to register? Now, this brings focus on two of the more important definitions in the act itself that is set out in section 2, which is that you ought to be a Guyanese or a Guyanese national to be able to be registered. So you have to understand who first is a Guyanese national, or who is, or what would be classified as a Guyanese company. Now, to be qualified and issued a local content registration certificate, if you are an individual and you're looking for employment, because there's two registers, one for employment of Guyanese nationals, and as well as one for procurement purposes of goods and services from Guyanese nationals or Guyanese companies. So a Guyanese national is essentially a person who is a citizen of Guyana. Now, Part 4 of the Constitution kind of leads us as to understanding who is a citizen and how a person can gain citizenship in Guyana. You can either be a citizen by birth in country, or if you're born outside of Guyana, you are born to Guyanese parents who were born in country, or it can be through marriage or naturalization. All right, and that's, once you're that and you provide documentation showing that, then you would be classified as a Guyanese national and qualified to be registered as such. Now, if you're coming as a Guyanese company, then it's a little bit more than just simply being a citizen. And I do not want to mess this up, so I want to directly read from the legislation. This is Section 2 of the Local Content Act, which sets out pertinent definitions. It says that Guyanese company means any company incorporated under the Companies Act. So let me just explain that incorporation doesn't mean that you can simply come and register an external company. Mm-hmm. You have to be incorporated in accordance with the legislation, right? And it has to be beneficially owned by Guyanese nationals who ultimately exercise, either individually or jointly, voting rights representing at least 51% of the total issued shares of the company. And that company has to have Guyanese nationals holding at least 75% of executive and senior management positions and at least 90% of non-managerial and other positions. As long as you qualify as such, then you are issued. That it's simply that you provide documentation to say that you meet the qualifications that are set out in the legislation, and you are issued with this. But I must say that there is an obligation placed on Guyanese nationals and Guyanese companies who want to participate in the industry, because if you are not registered, you will not be counted for the purpose of local content obligations or compliance for the contractors, subcontractors, or licensees. So even though you're a national, you can show all of that. When it's time for compliance, assessing the compliance of these contractors, subcontractors, or licensees, you cannot be counted, even though they would have used you, just because you don't have this local content certificate or you're not on the register. Also, the other obligation placed on Guyanese nationals and Guyanese companies is that if it is that your status somehow changes, you're no longer a Guyanese national, or your company is no longer set up in such a way that it can be classified as a Guyanese company, then if you don't immediately report that to the local content secretariat of your status of change, you are actually committing an offense and you can be fined.
So, in a brief synopsis, if you could tell us, what does this certificate do? You have the certificate in your hand. What does it allow you to do?
It allows you to just participate. It allows you to be able to benefit and allows the aims and the objective of the legislation to actually be carried out. Because if you don't have that piece if you don't have that piece of paper, if you want to call it that, a certificate to say that I am a Guyanese national, I am a Guyanese company in accordance with the legislation, you cannot be counted for the purpose of that piece of legislation. Right. And companies will not engage with you because they want to be compliant.
Right. So the certificate makes you compliant with the legislation.
So it makes you as well as the company. You help the company to be compliant.
Thank you for that explanation. Now you've mentioned some terms there in your explanation: contractors, subcontractors, and licensees, but and you've mentioned that Guyanese and Guyanese companies have an obligation to obtain this local content certificate to participate when it is required. But what are the obligations of these persons or these companies, contractors, subcontractors, licensees?
Okay, Richard. So, like Renata said, it's very important for these persons, contractors, subcontractors, and licensees, to be in compliance with the Act, because if you don't, then it's an offense and you're liable, right? And there's hefty fines that are attached to these offenses. So, in carrying out any petroleum operation in Guyana, the licensees, contractors, and subcontractors, there are 40 sectors in the Local Content Act, which can be found in the first schedule, in which they have to be compliant with. Now, in being compliant, there are basically 2 plans that they have to submit. If you recall earlier, I said that plans and reports and records, applications and approvals, they have to be done by the minister with the help of the Secretariat. So one of the plans that these persons, when I say persons, I'm referring to contractors, subcontractors, and licensees. One of the plans that they have to submit is called a master plan. Now, a master plan is basically a 5-year forecast of all the needs and perceived available resources and capacity for employment that the company may need in procurement, for instance. Then the other plan is let me just get this right, it's the annual plan. And like the name suggests, this is done yearly. Now, this annual plan, it's basically like a subsection of the master plan, so it's done against that backdrop. So this is just saying a yearly projection of the same things like what you would have included in your master plan, a forecast of your procurement, your employment capacity, and the services that you may need. Also included in the submission of those plans, and I'm just going to give you a quick excerpt from the Act. It says that in the plans and the subplans on employment, procurement and local capacity must be submitted. So the employment of subplan details Guyanese nationals which will benefit from specific contractors, subcontractors, or licensees' employment and training opportunities and the time frame applicable to the delivery of these benefits. So in addition to the annual plan and the master plan, there is also the subplans. And this is just going to give you a more in-depth analysis of what the company is requiring.
So, if you could just take us through, how is this obligation, or rather local content, measured?
I must first say that the person who is responsible for really setting the guidelines and how local content should be measured outside of what is already expressed in the legislation, as Candy said, against the first schedule, is the minister, right? And in regard to this, the schedule sets out, as she said, 40 sectors for now, in which we have, through consultative approaches, seen proven capacity from the Guyanese nationals and Guyanese public. So when we, to be able to measure their compliance, it's really against the factors that you actually take into consideration would be their total expenditure against the schedule and the breakdown or the percentage that is required. So if I may give an example, say for instance, the provision of local legal services, I believe it's set out at 90%. That's how much expenditure a contractor, subcontractor, or a licensee must spend on local legal services. So if you spend in the entirety $1,000 for the reporting period on local legal services, well, 90% of that would be $900. I believe $900 should be reflecting for you to meet your local content requirements that are set out. But And the converse of that would be 10% of it can be spent elsewhere. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to spend it elsewhere. You could put 100% into Guyana, but you can use other persons, including Guyanese, but if they're not registered, you can use them just for that 10% purpose, or foreign companies or otherwise. So it's always against the schedule. So whatever you expend as a contractor, subcontractor, or a licensee, it must, once it's a regulated sector, right, it must be within those percentages that are set out in the schedule for us to establish your compliance within that period.
And this is very important because this is the government actually saying that, look, against these numbers, whatever the percentage may be, you must engage Guyanese.
Yes.
So I could only imagine that some sectors it's at 100%.
Some, yes.
And as the country continues to build capacity, the others would eventually increase that are not up there. But I see you have the act here.
Yes, but the legislation also, if I might add, caters for instances where even though we have a percentage there, we don't have the capacity, or persons haven't come forward through their procurement procedure, whether they tendered out, and there's no person that is actually meeting that. So if you cannot meet your local content requirements, then there is provision for the minister to waive that requirement if there's no proven capacity, or if you would, before the coming into operation of the act, there would have been a master services agreement where you were providing all these different things together, and that agreement still remains in force at the time of the act coming into play.
This first schedule, as you mentioned, sets out a list of some 40 sectors.
Yes.
That is quite exhaustive. But if we could just touch on a few which might be important, and or those which entail 100% or 90% or 80% participation.
Well, as you know, the law is alive. And as we regulate society, we have to regulate that in accordance with how society is developing in itself. At the time of developing this list, which it's not set in stone, as you know, legislation will move and go with the society as a whole. Through consultative processes, we did come up with appropriate measures based on what we knew was the capacity in Guyana at the time. So if I can identify the ones that are 100%, right now we have them at immigration support services, work permit, visa application, visa on arrival and in-water activity permit, custom beverage services, and ground transportation services, like movement of personnel and whatnot. So for now, that's what is at 100%. If I can mention, the lowest percentage here is 10%, and that's in the metrology services. And we have lower percentages in structural fabrication for cutting, bending, assembly of steel products onshore and whatnot, and those are at 30%, whilst waste management in the disposal and waste transporting services with hazardous waste, specifically for the oil and gas industry, at 25%, because we didn't have certain capacity to fill that at the time, right? But certain things that are necessarily located in Guyana and should be used by, you should utilize the services of Guyanese, that was an obvious given, right? Like rental of office spaces, accommodation services like apartments and whatnot. Those are the higher percentages set out in the legislation.
Right. And that there is very important because it allows Guyanese to get the first preference.
Yes.
And the companies must reach out to Guyanese first, and that is what makes this legislation so important as well. But what are the consequences of failing to meet your obligations under this legislation?
Okay, so remember earlier we spoke about the penalties and offenses, and we did say that there's a weighty penalty attached. So the local content legislation, it provides for a slew of offenses and their corresponding penalties. I'm just going to touch on, all of them are important, equally important. We should not find ourselves in any situation whereby we're committing an offense or we're liable of an offense. But I'm just going to touch on the most popular ones. And one is where there's the submission of a plan, a local content plan, and that person knows or they have reasonable knowledge or they ought to have known that the information that you provide, it's misleading or it's false. Now, in the case of an individual, you're liable. First of all these offenses, they carry the penalty of you're liable summary, right? And they have various fines. Now, in this case, if you're an individual, you could be fined up to $5 million. And in the case of a company or a business, you could be fined a maximum of $10 million. And that's pretty heavy. Another offense is where you have the submission on information for the issuance of a certificate, the certificate that Renetta spoke of earlier, for you to participate in the petroleum sector. So if you're providing information in your application to have this certificate issued and the information that you're provided is wrong, it's false, or you have reasons to believe it's false, you could be fined a maximum of $10 million. Now, if you have another offense is where you're carrying out petroleum operations without being issued a certificate, you could be fined a maximum of $50 million. So it's very, very important, and I'm going to implore that you ensure that in order for you to participate in the petroleum sector, that you obtain your certificate and you obtain it by providing the correct information. They have lighter sentences, and one is where you fail to submit a performance report, and that would be a fine of $1 million. Also, the minister at any time, the act gives him the authority and the discretion to carry out investigations on persons or businesses that are involved in the petroleum sector. He just have to have, I guess, the reasonable suspicion, Renetta, or just, if he wants to carry out an investigation, he could do so. And where somebody fails to submit for that investigation, or that business fails to submit for an investigation, they are also fined summarily and the conviction of a fine of $1 million. But the legislation provides for a whole range of offenses, but I'm unable to go through all of it because of time.
Okay. Well, thank you for those that you did go through.
And I should mention, Richard, I'm so sorry, that where the offense is being committed by a body corporate and it has been proven to have been committed with the consent or attributable to the negligence of any director or a manager or any agent that's acting in the capacity as that person, they're also faced with the same penalty for the corresponding offense.
Okay, so it's wide-reaching.
Yes, it is, and anybody could be, in the hot water.
Now this is the government putting law in place for the people to protect the rights of the people, to ensure fair treatment. So one thing I wish to discuss is how the Act address the question of equal treatment, specifically in relation to the issue of remuneration or payment and salary, wages, and in relation to Guyanese when compared to expatriates. Because we do have an influx of expats in the country, and I would believe that this act also addresses that issue.
You are right, Richard. It's a very topical issue. A lot of persons have brought it to the forefront, and they're saying, okay, I'm working the same amount of hours, I'm doing the same job and whatnot as an expat, but somehow they believe that they are not being remunerated, not just paid, but remunerated with the allowances and everything that is given to an expat in the same way. So as my colleague would have mentioned before, that the contractors, subcontractors, and licensees, they have certain obligations to provide a master plan or an annual plan, a local content plan, for the approval by the minister. Now, in those plans, there are several sub-plans. As she would have indicated, there's an employment sub-plan, there's a procurement sub-plan, and there's a local capacity development sub-plan. Within the employment sub-plan itself, which can be found in the second schedule, the contractors, subcontractors, and the licensees have the obligation of detailing programs for the equal treatment of Guyanese nationals. And this includes the equal treatment in the form of equal remuneration. And this is regardless of your sex, your race, your political opinion, and any other discriminating factor. And the thing about this piece of legislation is that it doesn't just require those players to submit this information, but it also provides for the instances of enforcing it, and where it is that they fail to follow through with their approved plans. Once a plan is approved, you ought to stick with it and follow through with it. And if you're unable to do that, then there's fines up to $10 million for not doing so. So the legislation provides as well as enforces.
Okay, thank you. I know shortly after this act was enacted, a certain company, I'm not going to call names, challenged the legislation. And could you talk us through this and what were the positive outcomes of this matter?
Well, to briefly touch on the issue without calling any names, the Local Content Act was the subject of a judicial review application by a company who wanted to participate in the industry. And as you know, if you're not issued with the certificate, then the contractors, subcontractors, or licensees may not look in your direction because they want to be compliant at the end of the day, right? Regardless of how much, how good of a company you are and how much you can bring to the table, they prefer to be compliant with the law, right? And in this application, it was a case where they were refused registration based on several considerations. But what came out at the end of that, the government did, well, it really turned on the interpretation of who was a Guyanese national and a Guyanese company, and what considerations ought to be taken for persons to be actually registered and issued with this certificate. Now, the government did lose in this situation. They were not successful in this application. This is well known. But the positive or the silver lining in this is that it identified the need for further regulation of the sector because certain things we thought were very obvious to take into consideration. And now it's a case, even though you have administrative functions that don't necessarily need to be legislated, sometimes persons are going to use that as a loophole to challenge a piece of legislation to say, you know what, well, it didn't say so y'all give me this or y'all give me that. And it's not necessarily the case, right? And but the Chief Justice did rule, and she did indicated that, you know what, it is good that we have this challenge so we can see exactly where the holes are and that we can plug it immediately, so that at the end of the day, everyone who ought to be benefiting will benefit in the most positive light.
Right, and you know, this was the first kind of legislation of this nature that the country had. So, as you said, it's alive and it is susceptible to modifications as time go on. But as we come down to the end of the program, I would just give you both the opportunity to tell us one thing that you think is a major advantage to the people of Guyana, and the achievement of the aims and objectives of this legislation here, which you could think of.
Okay, in a recent report, it was reported that ExxonMobil have expended over 180 billion Guyanese dollars in upholding the local content obligations, and this would be in either capacity development, in procuring goods and services from Guyanese and Guyanese businesses. So this is a real big boost in Guyanese economy, and there's so much more in store in the future if local content obligation is continued to being met by these companies and once it's enforced by the Secretariat and the Minister. Sorry.
I agree with Candy. You see more and more of the contractors, subcontractors, and licensees becoming more compliant with the legislation and the aims and the objectives of the legislation, which is to retain monetary value and build local capacity in Ghana, is being seen. All right. Just recently, I believe it was in May, some of those same contractors, licensees, and subcontractors were issued with their compliance certificates. I believe there was Halliburton, ExxonMobil, Saipem, just to name a few. Another spin-off from the direct monetary value going back to Guyanese is that the Guyanese themselves are also becoming compliant. So if you need to get your ducks in a row as it concerns your businesses and your companies, then persons are making sure that they're following the letter and the spirit of legislation that governs that governs the regulation of businesses like that. So we are glad to see that everyone is pulling themselves together because everyone wants to derive the benefit, and as I said initially, this is the government is creating an economy or a space that's not just rapidly growing, but one that is sustainable, and one where you the citizens don't have to wait until the government hands something to you, but you can do it yourself. As long as you're compliant, you can get in and benefit directly from resources that belongs to us.
Right. Thank you both for being on the program today. I don't know if there's anything else you would like to say. I would give you that opportunity now. No? Okay. Well, thank you both for going through this tedious legislation here with me today. I think this was quite beneficial. As you know, many persons are not quite aware as to what local content is, and it's good that you were able to explain the requirements and obligations of citizens or Guyanese and companies and contractors and all that is necessary to obtain a local content certificate, to participate in the industry, and to reap the benefits. Indeed, we have seen a lot of benefit derived because of the passing of this legislation. You know, you mentioned billions of dollars that were spent on local businesses that they were able to get that. So this is indeed a phenomenal piece of legislation and very much for the citizens of the country. Well, as we come down to the end of the program, I would just like to remind that this is an initiative brought to you. This program is an initiative brought to you, the people of this country, Guyana, the citizens, by the government of Guyana through the chambers of the Attorney General and Ministry of Legal Affairs, so that you can benefit. And when we go through these laws and legislation, you are aware of what they entail, you know, clear any misconceptions that might exist. If there are penalties within the laws, you are also aware of that, so you know you could never say, "Oh, I didn't know."
Yes.
So this program seeks to do that for you. Again, thank you, Ms. Renetta Sargent, a Principal Legal Advisor, and Ms. Candace Lewis, the State Counsel, for joining me today to simplify the Local Content Act.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.